The subtle shift in tone, the carefully placed compliment followed by a request that feels less like an ask and more like an obligation. The friend who always seems to need something, but frames their needs as a test of your loyalty. The colleague who praises your work in public, only to subtly undermine your authority behind the scenes. These are not grand dramatic betrayals, but the quiet everyday aggressions that chip away at our autonomy, distort our perceptions, and leave us feeling drained, confused, or vaguely guilty. We often dismiss them as personality quirks or misunderstandings, yet they are the ubiquitous threads of manipulation woven into the fabric of our daily interactions. Why do we so often fail to recognize these tactics, and what deeper truths do they reveal about human nature and our susceptibility to influence? This essay embarks on an exploration of the pervasive manipulation tactics encountered in daily life, dissecting their psychological mechanisms and illuminating their spiritual implications. We will integrate insights from contemporary psychology, uncovering the cognitive biases and social dynamics that render us vulnerable, with profound wisdom from various spiritual traditions that offer tools for discernment, resilience, and authentic selfhood. Crucially, we will overlay this analysis with the radical philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche, whose incisive breakdown of human will, power, and morality provides a challenging yet essential framework for understanding the underlying drives that fuel both the manipulator and the manipulated. By weaving these diverse perspectives, we aim to uncover not just the how of manipulation, but the deeper why, the existential and spiritual vulnerabilities it exploits. From a psychological standpoint, manipulation thrives on our inherent cognitive biases and social conditioning. Our desire for approval, our fear of confrontation, our need for belonging, and our tendency to trust authority figures all create fertile ground for others to covertly steer our thoughts and actions. We will delve into concepts such as gaslighting, which systematically erodes one's sense of reality, guilt-tripping, which weaponizes empathy, and love bombing, a tactic that preys on our longing for connection. Understanding the mechanics of these tactics, from the subtle linguistic cues to the exploitation of attachment styles, offers a critical first step toward building psychological boundaries and fostering mental clarity. Psychology reveals the intricate dance of influence, the patterns of thought and behavior that make us both perpetrators and victims in the silent battles for control. Simultaneously, spiritual wisdom offers a vital, often overlooked dimension to this understanding. Buddhist teachings on the nature of ego, attachment, and ignorance, avidya, illuminate how our clinging to certain outcomes, identities, or illusions of control can be exploited. Christian contemplative traditions emphasize discernment, the spiritual capacity to distinguish truth from deception, and warn against the spiritual blindness that can leave us vulnerable to falsehoods. Sufi mysticism speaks to the purification of the heart and the conquering of the nafs, ego self, whose unexamined desires and fears become entry points for external manipulation. Existential philosophy, while not strictly spiritual, echoes these concerns by highlighting the constant tension between authenticity and self-deception, urging us to confront the anxiety of freedom and responsibility, rather than succumb to external pressures. These traditions provide not just a diagnosis of our vulnerabilities, but also a profound pathway toward inner freedom and unshakable self-possession. The integration of Nietzsche's philosophy, however, introduces a bracing and often uncomfortable lens. For Nietzsche, human interaction is fundamentally driven by the will to power, not necessarily brute force, but the drive to grow, overcome, and assert one's values. Manipulation, in this light, can be seen as a sophisticated, often insidious expression of this will, where one individual seeks to impose their will upon another, subtly or overtly. His concepts of quote 3 reveal how the quote 4 can manipulate the quote 5 through the invention of moral systems based on resentment, while the quote 6 might manipulate through overt displays of power or the subtle enforcement of their own values. Nietzsche challenges us to look beyond conventional morality to understand the raw, often unconscious, power dynamics at play, forcing us to ask, is this influence an affirmation of life or a denial? An act of self-overcoming or a symptom of weakness and resentment? His work compels us to confront the uncomfortable truths about power, agency, and the origins of our own moral frameworks, which can themselves be tools of manipulation. Throughout this exploration, we will first lay a comprehensive psychological and spiritual framework, detailing the core theories and wisdom traditions relevant to manipulation. Subsequently, we will examine the modern manifestations of these tactics, particularly in the digital age, where social media and algorithmic influence present new frontiers for subtle control. Brief illustrative examples drawn from historical figures, contemporary anecdotes, and research case studies will bring these theoretical concepts to life without devolving into narrative fiction. Finally, we will synthesize these insights into practical strategies for developing resilience, cultivating discernment, and fostering genuine authenticity in a world saturated with subtle attempts to sway us. Our journey is one toward profound self-awareness, equipping us not to become cynical, but to stand firm in our truth, discerning the threads of manipulation and choosing a path of conscious agency and spiritual integrity. We now turn our attention to the foundational frameworks that allow us to apprehend the multifaceted nature of daily manipulation, the psychological and the spiritual. These two lenses, while distinct in their origins and methodologies, converge in their insights into human vulnerability and resilience, providing the initial scaffolding upon which our deeper inquiry, informed by Nietzsche, will rest. From a psychological vantage point, manipulation is not merely an unfortunate interpersonal dynamic. It is a calculated, often unconscious, exploitation of our inherent cognitive biases and emotional vulnerabilities. We are, by design, social creatures, wired for connection, belonging, and approval. These very strengths, however, become the primary conduits for subtle aggressions. The desire to be liked, to avoid conflict, to maintain harmony, or to secure a position within a group can render us profoundly susceptible. Manipulators, whether wittingly or unwittingly, instinctively target these psychological soft spots, transforming our natural inclinations into leverage. Consider the pervasive desire for approval, a deeply ingrained human need stemming from our evolutionary history where social acceptance was synonymous with survival. Manipulators exploit this by employing tactics like quote 7, an initial deluge of affection, praise, and attention designed to create a rapid, intense bond. This tactic overwhelms our critical faculties, triggering dopamine responses associated with reward and belonging. When the manipulator subsequently withdraws this affection, offers it conditionally, or subtly introduces criticism, we are left feeling a profound sense of loss and an urgent desire to regain the initial warmth. Our innate need for approval then compels us to conform, to appease, or to doubt our own perceptions, rather than risk further withdrawal. We become, in essence, Pavlovian subjects, conditioned to seek the manipulator's favour, often at the expense of our own boundaries and self-respect. Similarly, our aversion to confrontation and our innate desire for harmony are fertile grounds for manipulative tactics such as guilt-tripping or passive aggression. Guilt-tripping operates by leveraging our empathy and our fear of being perceived as selfish or uncaring. The manipulator frames their desires or needs in a way that implies we are responsible for their suffering if we do not comply. Phrases like, "After all I've done for you," or "I guess my feelings don't matter," are designed to induce a powerful sense of obligation and shame, overriding our rational assessment of the situation. We find ourselves agreeing to requests, sacrificing our own needs, or apologizing for perceived slights, not because we genuinely believe it is right, but because the emotional burden of guilt becomes too heavy to bear. Passive aggression, on the other hand, avoids direct conflict while still expressing hostility or resistance. It manifests as subtle sabotage, veiled insults, procrastination, or deliberate inefficiency, leaving us feeling confused, frustrated, and unable to address the underlying issue directly. The lack of overt aggression makes it difficult to pinpoint, often leading us to question our own reactions and internalize the blame. Gaslighting, a particularly insidious form of psychological manipulation, directly attacks our sense of reality and self-trust. It involves systematically planting seeds of doubt in our minds about our own memories, perceptions, or sanity. The manipulator might deny events that clearly occurred, contradict statements they previously made, or dismiss our feelings as irrational or overly sensitive. The goal is to destabilize our internal compass, making us reliant on the manipulator's version of reality. Over time, this erosion of self-trust can lead to chronic confusion, anxiety, and a profound sense of disorientation, rendering us highly vulnerable to further control. We begin to second-guess our own experiences, attributing our distress to personal failings rather than external manipulation, thus deepening the cycle of dependency. Beyond these specific tactics, a broader psychological vulnerability lies in our susceptibility to cognitive biases that distort our perception of self and others. Confirmation bias, for instance, leads us to seek out and interpret information in a way that confirms our existing beliefs, making it difficult to recognize manipulative patterns if we initially trust a person. The halo effect can cause us to attribute positive qualities to someone we admire, blinding us to their darker intentions. Conversely, the horn effect can lead us to unfairly judge someone based on a single negative trait. Manipulators often exploit these biases, cultivating an image that prevents scrutiny or leveraging existing prejudices to their advantage. Our innate need for coherence and narrative closure can also make us reluctant to admit we have been duped, leading us to rationalize the manipulator's behavior rather than confront the uncomfortable truth. Yet, a purely psychological explanation, while illuminating, fails to fully capture the depth of human vulnerability to manipulation. It provides the how, but often falls short on the why, especially when considering the profound sense of emptiness or spiritual malaise that often accompanies prolonged exposure to manipulative dynamics. This is where a spiritual framework becomes indispensable, offering a lens through which to understand the deeper dimensions of human autonomy, integrity, and the forces that seek to undermine them. From a spiritual perspective, our susceptibility to manipulation often stems from an unexamined ego, a fragmented sense of self, and a misplaced reliance on external validation. Most spiritual traditions, in their diverse expressions, speak to the importance of cultivating an authentic self, free from the dictates of the lower self or the pressures of the external world. Buddhist teachings, for example, emphasize the concept of anatta, non-self, and the suffering, dukkha, that arises from attachment to a fixed, independent self and its desires. When we are deeply attached to external outcomes, be it approval, status, or material possessions, we create vulnerabilities that manipulators readily exploit. Our craving for validation, our aversion to discomfort, and our identification with transient roles or identities become the very hooks upon which manipulation latches. The path to liberation, in this context, involves cultivating mindfulness and detachment, learning to observe these cravings and aversions without being consumed by them, thereby dismantling the internal mechanisms that make us susceptible. A centered, mindful individual is less easily swayed by flattery or threats, as their sense of worth is not contingent on external affirmation. Christian discernment, particularly within the contemplative traditions, offers a framework for distinguishing between spirits, between influences that lead towards truth, peace, and love, and those that lead towards deception, confusion, and despair. This process of discernment requires profound self-awareness, an honest examination of one's own motivations, and a willingness to confront inner shadows. Manipulation, in this light, can be seen as a deceptive spirit, clouding judgment and leading individuals away from their true spiritual path. The antidote lies in cultivating humility, seeking inner guidance, and adhering to principles of integrity and truth, thereby building an inner fortress against external deceit. Sufi mysticism, with its focus on the nafs, the lower self or ego, provides another powerful framework. The nafs is often described as the seat of our base desires, our pride, selfishness, and worldly attachments. It is the part of us that seeks dominance, recognition, and gratification, and it is precisely these unpurified aspects that manipulators target. The Sufi path is one of tazkiyat al-nafs, purification of the self, a rigorous journey of self-discipline, introspection, and surrender to divine will. By understanding and taming the nafs, individuals develop an inner strength and clarity that makes them immune to the subtle lures and coercive pressures of manipulation. When our actions are rooted in a purified heart rather than egoic desires, the manipulator's tools lose their efficacy. Existential philosophy, while not strictly a spiritual tradition, profoundly resonates with these themes by emphasizing authenticity and self-possession. Thinkers like Kierkegaard and Sartre underscore the burden and freedom of choice, and the imperative to live in accordance with one's true self, even in the face of societal pressures or the set, quote 15. To be manipulated is, in essence, to surrender one's authentic agency, to allow another's will to dictate one's choices and perceptions. The call to authenticity is a call to reclaim that agency, to confront the anxieties of freedom, and to define one's own values and meaning, thereby rendering external attempts at control impotent. It is a profound act of spiritual self-assertion. Across these diverse traditions, a common thread emerges. The journey towards resilience against manipulation is fundamentally an inner journey. It requires a deep understanding of our own psychological landscape, our biases, our emotional triggers, our unfulfilled needs, as well as a profound spiritual commitment to self-knowledge, authenticity, and inner freedom. We must learn to distinguish between genuine connection and exploitative attachment, between healthy interdependence and insidious control. By cultivating an authentic sense of self, anchored not in external validation but in inner wisdom and integrity, we build an unshakable foundation. This foundation allows us to navigate the pervasive landscape of human influence with discernment, to recognize the subtle aggressions that seek to diminish us, and to stand firm in our truth. It is this comprehensive psychological and spiritual framework that prepares us for the bracing and often uncomfortable lens of Nietzsche, who will challenge us to look even deeper into the very Gestal quote 16 that underpins these daily struggles for influence and autonomy. Having established the psychological and spiritual scaffolding within which we understand the mechanisms and vulnerabilities pertaining to daily manipulation, we now turn to a philosophical lens that, while bracing and often uncomfortable, offers unparalleled clarity into the underlying drives of power and will, that of Friedrich Nietzsche. His insights, often misinterpreted, provide a radical departure from conventional moral frameworks, revealing the raw, unvarnished dynamics that fuel both the act of manipulation and our susceptibility to it. We approach Nietzsche not as an advocate for tyranny, but as a diagnostician of human nature, whose profound observations illuminate the pervasive, often unconscious, struggle for influence that defines our interactions. At the core of Nietzsche's philosophy, and central to our analysis, is the concept of the quote 17. This is frequently misunderstood as a simplistic drive for domination or physical aggression. However, for Nietzsche, the will to power is a much broader, more fundamental cosmological and psychological principle. It is the essential driving force behind all life, a ceaseless striving for growth, overcoming, self-mastery, and the imposition of one's own values and perspectives upon the world. It is the impulse to become more, to actualize potential, to expand and affirm life, even at the cost of discomfort or struggle. Every organism, every individual, every society, according to Nietzsche, operates under the impetus of this will, seeking to express and enhance its power in myriad forms, be it through creation, understanding, artistry, or indeed influence over others. When we apply this lens to the phenomenon of manipulation, the will to power reveals itself as the engine behind the manipulator's actions. The manipulator, whether consciously or unconsciously, is engaged in an assertion of their will over another. They seek to overcome resistance, to impose their desires, to shape another's reality or behavior according to their own ends. This is not necessarily a malicious desire to harm, but rather a fundamental drive to extend and affirm their own power, often at the expense of the other's autonomy. The love bomber, for instance, seeks to envelop and control through an overwhelming display of affection, thereby binding the other's will to their own. The gaslighter endeavours to shatter the victim's sense of reality, thus consolidating their own interpretive power. In each instance, the manipulator is expressing a form of the will to power, striving to make another's will subservient to their own. Conversely, our susceptibility to manipulation, from a Nietzschean perspective, can be seen as an attenuated or misdirected will to power within ourselves. When we succumb to guilt-tripping passive aggression or the erosion of our boundaries, we are, in a sense, allowing another's will to overcome our own. This often stems from an underlying desire for comfort, approval, or belonging, forms of power that are externalized and dependent on others, rather than emanating from an authentic, self-possessed core. We become instruments of another's will, sacrificing our own self-overcoming for the perceived ease of conformity or acceptance. Nietzsche would challenge us to recognize this capitulation as a failure to assert our own inherent will to power, to create our own values and define our own existence. This brings us to a crucial distinction in Nietzsche's thought, that between master morality and slave morality. These are not classifications of individuals as inherently good or bad, but rather descriptions of two distinct value systems that emerge from different psychological positions. Master morality arises from strength, nobility, and self-affirmation. The master creates values, defines what is good based on what enhances their own life and power, e.g., strength, pride, courage, creativity, and looks down upon what is bad as that which is weak, timid, or common. This morality is characterized by an active, self-legislating will. The manipulator, in their active assertion of will, often operates from a position that, however distorted, mirrors certain aspects of master morality's drive for self-assertion, albeit directed outwardly in a way that diminishes others. Slave morality, by contrast, arises from weakness, suffering, and resentment. It is a reactive morality, born of the oppressed who, unable to directly challenge their masters, invent a system of values that demonizes the qualities of the powerful, e.g., strength becomes evil, pride becomes sinful, and elevates their own conditions, e.g., humility, pity, obedience, patience become good. This morality is characterized by a passive, reactive will, constantly looking for external validation and defining itself in opposition to an external other. It is within the framework of slave morality that many of our vulnerabilities to manipulation are most acutely exploited. Our desire for approval, our fear of confrontation, our adherence to societal norms of niceness or selflessness. These are often echoes of slave morality, making us ripe targets for guilt-tripping. How could you be so selfish? Passive aggression. I guess I'll just do it myself even though I'm so tired. Or appeals to our supposed moral duty. We become entangled in a web of external expectations, losing sight of our own intrinsic worth and agency. Nietzsche's critique of conventional morality is therefore profoundly relevant. He argues that much of what we accept as universally good or bad is in fact a product of slave morality, designed to control and suppress the stronger, more individualistic wills. This herd morality can be a powerful tool for manipulation, as it provides a ready-made framework for shaming, guilt-tripping, and coercing individuals into conformity. The manipulator often skillfully wields these societal moral codes, presenting their demands as righteous, necessary, or for our own good, while painting any resistance as selfish, arrogant, or morally reprehensible. We internalize these moral imperatives, often unconsciously, making us complicit in our own subjugation when we sacrifice our authentic desires and boundaries for the sake of perceived moral rectitude or social harmony. Furthermore, the concept of resentment is vital to understanding the dynamics of manipulation. Resentment is a deeply ingrained, often unconscious, psychological state stemming from the inability to act directly upon one's desires or grievances. Instead of confronting the source of their frustration, the individual experiencing resentment internalizes these feelings, transforming them into a simmering resentment, envy, or bitterness that then seeks indirect forms of expression. This can manifest in the manipulator as a subtle undermining of others, a need to control or diminish those perceived as stronger or happier, or a passive-aggressive withholding of support, all driven by an unacknowledged envy or sense of inadequacy. For the manipulated, resentment can manifest as an inability to assert boundaries, leading to compliance fueled by unspoken anger or a desire for eventual indirect revenge, or even self-pity that makes them vulnerable to those who offer false solace. It is a poison that corrodes authentic interaction and fosters an environment ripe for subtle aggression. From a Nietzschean perspective, the path to resisting manipulation is not found in adherence to conventional moral codes, but in a radical re-evaluation of values and the cultivation of one's own authentic will to power. This means recognizing the inherent drive within us to grow, to overcome, and to define ourselves, rather than allowing external forces or the wills of others to dictate our existence. It demands intellectual honesty, self-awareness, and the courage to create our own values, to say yes to ourselves even when it means saying no to others, and to embrace the discomfort of self-assertion. This is not an endorsement of manipulating others, but rather a call to self-mastery, to become the architects of our own lives, impervious to the subtle aggressions that seek to diminish our autonomy. Nietzsche's framework compels us to look beyond the superficial kindness or apparent altruism that often cloaks manipulative behaviors, and instead to discern the underlying will that seeks to exert influence. It challenges us to examine our own motivations for compliance. Are we acting from genuine self-will, or from a reactive position of fear, guilt, or the desire for external approval? By embracing this uncomfortable lens, we gain not only a deeper understanding of the pervasive nature of manipulation, but also the philosophical tools to forge a more resilient, authentic, and self-possessed existence, one that actively affirms our own will to power in the pursuit of genuine self-overcoming rather than passive subjugation. This understanding is foundational as we move to examine the modern manifestations of these tactics in our daily lives, armed with a multifaceted awareness of their psychological, spiritual, and philosophical underpinnings. Having laid the groundwork for understanding manipulation through the lenses of psychology, spirituality, and Nietzschean philosophy, we now turn our gaze toward the active manifestation of these dynamics in our daily lives. The theoretical frameworks, particularly Nietzsche's radical insights into the will to power and the interplay of master-slave morality, are not merely academic constructs. They serve as a bracing and often uncomfortable mirror, reflecting the subtle power struggles that define human interaction. We contend that true discernment begins not with the identification of external aggressors, but with an unflinching examination of our own internal landscape, where our will either asserts itself authentically or is unwittingly subjugated. The will to power, as Nietzsche posited, is the fundamental drive for growth, assertion, and the imposition of values. In the context of manipulation, we observe this will in its myriad forms, both overt and insidious. The manipulator, consciously or unconsciously, exercises their will to shape our perceptions, dictate our actions, and ultimately diminish our autonomy, all in service of their own desires or perceived needs. Their tactics, be they love-bombing, guilt-tripping, gaslighting, or passive aggression, are not random acts but calculated expressions of a will seeking to dominate. They aim to dismantle our internal compass, replacing it with their own, thereby securing our compliance and channeling our energies toward their ends. Yet, Nietzsche's philosophy compels us to look beyond the manipulator and scrutinize the manipulated. Our susceptibility, we argue, is not merely a passive state of vulnerability, but often reflects a misdirected or attenuated will to power within ourselves. When we succumb to manipulation, we are, in a profound sense, choosing to sacrifice our self-overcoming for a perceived comfort, for approval, or for the avoidance of conflict. This choice, often subconscious, aligns with the reactive values of slave morality, where the assertion of one's own desires is deemed selfish or unacceptable, and where strength is paradoxically found in compliance and self-abnegation. We are conditioned to fear the discomfort of asserting our own truth, preferring the illusory safety of conformity, even if it comes at the cost of our authentic selfhood. Consider the pervasive shadow of resentment. As previously discussed, resentment is a deep-seated, unconscious resentment born from an inability to act directly, leading to the creation of reactive values. In the manipulator, resentment can fuel the subtle undermining, the backhanded compliments, the insidious gossip, or the passive-aggressive behaviors designed to chip away at another's confidence without direct confrontation. Unable or unwilling to assert their will openly, they resort to indirect means, deriving a perverse satisfaction from the subtle erosion of another's standing or peace of mind. Their will, rather than building and creating, becomes a force of negation and diminution, often disguised as concern or helpfulness. Conversely, resentment can also fester within the manipulated. When we consistently suppress our own needs, desire, or anger in the face of manipulative pressure, we do not simply erase these feelings, we internalize them. This suppressed energy can manifest as chronic low-grade anxiety, a pervasive sense of guilt, or a simmering resentment that, like a slow poison, corrodes our self-esteem and clarity. We may find ourselves harboring unspoken grievances, replaying interactions, and mentally rehearsing confrontations we never enact. This internal resentment renders us further vulnerable, as our diminished sense of agency makes us more likely to accept subsequent impositions, reinforcing the cycle of compliance and self-betrayal. We become trapped in a self-imposed prison of reactivity, where our actions are dictated not by our authentic will, but by a fear of displeasing or a desire to avoid perceived negative consequences. Nietzsche's path to resistance, therefore, is not about fighting the manipulator on their terms, but about a radical re-evaluation of our own values. This is an imperative to confront and dismantle the slave morality that may have taken root within us, often unconsciously. It demands that we scrutinize the origins of our beliefs about selflessness, obligation, and approval. Are we acting from an intrinsic sense of purpose and strength, or are we reacting to external pressures, seeking validation, or avoiding the discomfort of standing alone? This re-evaluation is an arduous process, for it requires us to question the very foundations of our social conditioning and to differentiate between values that genuinely spring from our unique being and those that have been imposed upon us by family, society, or the subtle demands of the manipulator. To reclaim our authentic will to power means to consciously identify and affirm values that empower our growth and self-mastery. It is a process of asking, what truly strengthens me? What aligns with my deepest aspirations, independent of external judgment? What does it mean for me to thrive, to overcome, to create? This is not a call to egoistic disregard for others, but a prerequisite for genuine self-possession. For only when we are grounded in our own values can we engage with the world from a place of integrity rather than reactivity. This re-evaluation leads directly to the Nietzschean concept of Selbstüberwindung, or self-overcoming. Self-overcoming is the active, continuous process of transcending our weaknesses, our fears, and the external impositions that seek to define us. It is the courage to shed the comfortable shackles of conformity and to embrace the often uncomfortable journey of becoming who we truly are. In practical terms, this translates into tangible actions, setting clear boundaries, articulating our needs without apology, and accepting the discomfort that often accompanies non-compliance. When a manipulator attempts to guilt-trip us, self-overcoming means recognizing the tactic, acknowledging the uncomfortable feeling, and choosing to act in alignment with our own values, rather than succumbing to the imposed obligation. When gaslighted, it means trusting our own perception of reality, even when it is challenged, and refusing to internalize another's distorted narrative. The profound why of our vulnerability, then, becomes strikingly clear through Nietzsche's lens. We are vulnerable because authentic self-assertion is inherently difficult. It entails a profound responsibility for our own existence and the potential for isolation that comes from daring to be different. Nietzsche's philosophy calls us to embrace this burden of freedom, to become the architects of our own values, rather than passively adopting those imposed by others or by the pervasive currents of societal expectation. This embrace of existential authenticity is not merely a psychological exercise, it is a spiritual imperative, a journey towards inner freedom that liberates us from the tyranny of external validation and the insidious grip of manipulation. This journey demands courage, the courage to be unpopular, to disappoint, to say no, when every fibre of our social conditioning screams yes. The fear of being perceived as selfish is, after all, one of the most potent weapons of slave morality, designed to keep individuals in check, to prevent them from asserting a will that might disrupt the existing power dynamic. To overcome this fear is to liberate ourselves from a fundamental manipulative tactic, to reclaim the right to define our own boundaries and priorities. It is to understand that genuine self-care is not selfishness, but a prerequisite for sustained well-being and the capacity to engage authentically with others. Thus, Nietzsche's framework provides a robust foundation for active resistance and self-mastery. It shifts the focus from merely identifying the tactics of others to cultivating an unshakable internal fortress of self-awareness and authentic will. This philosophical understanding, while challenging, empowers us to move beyond reactive vulnerability toward proactive discernment. We are now prepared to translate this deep theoretical comprehension into concrete, actionable strategies for navigating the complexities of daily interaction, especially as these dynamics manifest in the increasingly pervasive and subtle landscape of the digital age. The next step is to detail how we might operationalize this profound re-evaluation of values and commitment to self-overcoming in the face of ubiquitous manipulative forces. Having meticulously charted the theoretical landscapes of manipulation, its psychological underpinnings, spiritual vulnerabilities, and the Nietzschean philosophy of the will to power and resentment, we now turn our gaze to the contemporary manifestations of these subtle aggressions. The pervasive nature of manipulation has only been amplified and transmuted by the digital age, presenting new challenges to our discernment and autonomy. Following this exploration of modern tactics, we will synthesize our insights into practical strategies designed to cultivate resilience, sharpen discernment, and foster genuine authenticity and conscious agency in the face of such ubiquitous forces. The digital realm, with its ubiquitous connectivity and curated realities, has become a fertile ground for the evolution of manipulative tactics. What once required direct in-person interaction can now be executed with chilling efficiency and often greater anonymity across vast networks. Social media platforms in particular are engineered to exploit our fundamental human needs for connection, validation, and belonging, making us profoundly susceptible. Here, the curated self reigns supreme, where individuals meticulously construct idealized personas, presenting a polished facade of success, happiness, and desirability. This constant exposure to seemingly perfect lives can trigger deep-seated insecurities and a potent fear of missing out, FOMO, driving us to seek similar external validation. The like, the comment, the share, these become digital currencies of approval, a constant demand for affirmation that can be subtly leveraged by manipulators. They might use love bombing in the form of excessive public praise or selective engagement, creating an intoxicating sense of being valued, only to withdraw it later, leaving us craving its return. Conversely, the deliberate withholding of engagement, or even the subtle act of unfollowing or unfriending, can be a passive-aggressive tactic designed to induce anxiety and a desperate need to regain favor. Beyond individual interactions, social media fosters an outrage culture where moral indignation can be weaponized. Manipulators, often fueled by resentment, a festering resentment of those perceived as superior or simply different, can skillfully ignite a collective anger, directing it towards a target. This allows them to exert influence and control through the mobilization of public opinion, often under the guise of justice or moral righteousness. The anonymity and distance of online interactions can embolden individuals to engage in behaviors they would never contemplate face-to-face, leading to phenomena like cancel culture, which, while sometimes holding powerful figures accountable, can also be a brutal form of social manipulation, eroding nuance and critical thought in favor of mob rule. Online communication itself introduces new avenues for manipulation. The absence of nonverbal cues, tone of voice, facial expressions, body language, makes misinterpretation rampant, allowing manipulators to deny intentions or shift blame. Gaslighting becomes even more insidious in text-based exchanges, where a manipulator can easily reframe past conversations, delete messages, or simply deny ever saying something, leaving the manipulated questioning their own memory and sanity without the immediate corroboration of physical presence. Ghosting, the abrupt cessation of all communication without explanation, is a particularly cruel form of passive aggression, designed to leave the manipulated in a state of confusion, self-doubt, and often emotional distress, subtly eroding their self-worth. Furthermore, the proliferation of echo chambers and filter bubbles driven by algorithmic design means we are increasingly exposed only to information and perspectives that reinforce our existing beliefs. This creates a fertile ground for confirmation bias, making us less discerning and more susceptible to narratives, however flawed, that align with our pre-existing worldviews. Manipulators, whether individuals or larger entities, can exploit these structures to control information flow, shape perceptions, and subtly nudge opinions without overt coercion. Indeed, algorithmic manipulation represents a particularly sophisticated and often invisible form of influence. Personalized feeds, tailored advertisements, and suggested content are not neutral recommendations. They are carefully constructed pathways designed to optimize engagement, often by appealing to our known vulnerabilities, desires, and biases. This constant, personalized stream of information subtly shapes our preferences, our purchasing decisions, and even our political views. While seemingly benign, this constitutes a continuous low-level assault on our autonomous decision-making, a soft power play that seeks to dictate our choices by subtly narrowing the scope of our perceived options. It is the will to power of an unseen hand, guiding our attention and shaping our reality, often without our conscious awareness. Having surveyed the modern terrain of manipulation, we now pivot to the cultivation of practical strategies for self-defense and self-mastery. The journey towards resilience, discernment, and authenticity is not a passive one. It demands active engagement with our inner world and a courageous re-evaluation of our relationship with the external. Developing resilience. The bedrock of resistance to manipulation lies in a robust sense of self. This begins with radical self-awareness, the ability to identify our own emotional states, cognitive biases, and psychological triggers. We must learn to recognize when we are feeling insecure, anxious, overly eager for approval, or avoidant of conflict. These are the soft spots that manipulators instinctively probe. By understanding our internal landscape, we can anticipate vulnerabilities and respond proactively rather than reactively. Emotional regulation is a crucial companion to self-awareness. Manipulation thrives on our emotional reactivity. When we can observe our emotions without being swept away by them, when we can choose our response rather than being compelled by an immediate feeling, we reclaim a significant portion of our power. This is not about suppressing emotions, but about creating a space between stimulus and response, a space where conscious choice can emerge. This inner discipline is a practical application of Nietzschean Selbstüberwindung, self-overcoming, where we transcend our lower reactive impulses to assert a higher, more intentional will. Cultivating an inner locus of control means understanding that while we cannot control external events or the actions of others, we absolutely control our perceptions, interpretations, and responses. This shift from external validation to internal self-possession is a monumental step towards invulnerability. We become the authors of our own emotional narratives, rather than allowing manipulators to dictate them. Cultivating discernment. To navigate the labyrinth of subtle influence, we must sharpen our capacity for discernment. This involves a vigilant skepticism towards overt flattery or excessive praise, particularly when it feels disproportionate or comes from those who seek something from us. Manipulators often butter us up to lower our guard, making us more amenable to their demands. We must learn to attend to incongruence, the disjunction between words and actions. A manipulator's promises often diverge sharply from their behavior, their stated intentions from their actual impact. This discrepancy is a crucial signal that something is amiss. Trusting our intuition, our quote 48, is paramount, especially when facing gaslighting. When an interaction leaves us feeling confused, drained, or inexplicably guilty, despite a manipulator's assurances, we must honor that internal alarm bell. Our subconscious often registers inconsistencies before our conscious mind can articulate them. Finally, we must learn to identify patterns of behavior. Manipulation is rarely a one-off event. It is a recurring dynamic. By observing repeated cycles of certain tactics, e.g., cycles of charm and withdrawal, promises and failures, blame shifting, we can move beyond individual incidents and recognize the overarching strategy at play. This pattern recognition allows us to name the dynamic, which is the first step towards disarming it, fostering genuine authenticity and conscious agency. Ultimately, the most potent antidote to manipulation is the unwavering commitment to our authentic self and the courageous exercise of our conscious agency. This necessitates the setting of clear, firm boundaries, both verbal and non-verbal. Boundaries are not acts of aggression but declarations of self-respect, communicating what is acceptable and unacceptable in our interactions. They are the practical manifestation of our autonomous will. Practicing assertive communication means articulating our needs, desires, and limits directly and respectfully, without apology or aggression. It is the antithesis of passive aggression and subservience, embodying a balanced assertion of self. This will inevitably involve embracing discomfort, particularly the discomfort of confrontation or the perceived disapproval that can arise from saying no. Manipulators often exploit our aversion to conflict, but true agency requires us to lean into that discomfort, understanding that short-term unease is a small price for long-term integrity and freedom. This brings us to a radical form of self-responsibility, echoing Nietzsche's call to own one's values. We must take full responsibility for our choices, our reactions, and our internal states, refusing to allow others to dictate our self-worth or our reality. This means consciously choosing our values and living in alignment with them, rather than adopting values imposed by others or by societal expectations. The ultimate freedom from manipulation comes from detaching from outcome dependence, the need for a specific response or approval from others. When our sense of self-worth is internally generated and not contingent upon external validation, the manipulator's most potent weapon, the withholding of approval or the threat of rejection, loses its power. We become impervious to their attempts to define our value, standing firm in our self-possession. In conclusion, the journey from vulnerability to unassailable selfhood is a continuous process of rigorous self-examination, intellectual discernment, and courageous action. The digital age has merely amplified the urgency of this endeavour, presenting new fronts in the ancient battle for autonomy. By understanding the modern guises of manipulation, developing robust resilience, cultivating an unblinking discernment, and steadfastly fostering our authentic agency, we can navigate the daily currents of influence with integrity, reclaiming our sovereign will and forging a path of genuine self-overcoming. The task is not to eliminate all attempts at manipulation, for they are woven into the fabric of human interaction, but to render ourselves impermeable to their insidious effects, standing as conscious architects of our own lives. Having dissected the insidious mechanisms of manipulation, both psychological and spiritual, and illuminated their philosophical underpinnings through Nietzsche's bracing lens, we now arrive at the crucible of action. The intellectual understanding, while foundational, remains but a map. The true journey commences with its navigation. Our task in this chapter is to translate these profound theoretical insights, the recognition of vulnerability, the identification of tactics, the embrace of a sovereign will into tangible daily practices. We move from the what and why to the demanding and often uncomfortable how, charting a course for the operationalization of resistance and the architectonics of genuine self-overcoming. The pervasive nature of manipulation dictates that our defense cannot be a singular reactive act, but rather a continuous evolving process of self-fortification. It demands not merely awareness, but a disciplined cultivation of internal resources that render us less permeable to external impositions. This is the essence of reclaiming our sovereign will, an active, conscious engagement with our inner landscape and outer interactions, transforming us from unwitting subjects to deliberate agents. Resilience, in this context, is not merely bouncing back from adversity, but the proactive construction of an inner citadel impervious to the subtle aggressions that seek to erode our autonomy. It begins with radical self-awareness, a relentless and honest examination of our emotional states and triggers. This is more than a casual introspection. It is a systematic inquiry into the origins of our reactions, the biases that cloud our judgment, and the unmet needs that make us susceptible. To operationalize radical self-awareness, we must commit to practices that illuminate our internal world. Mindfulness meditation. Stripped of its often misdefined connotations, serves as a crucial tool. It trains the mind to observe thoughts and emotions without immediate judgment or entanglement, creating a vital space between stimulus and response. Through consistent practice, we learn to identify the subtle precursors to emotional reactivity, the tightening in the chest, the racing thought, the surge of anxiety, before they escalate into overwhelming states. This observational distance allows us to recognize when a manipulator's tactic is striking a pre-existing chord of insecurity or a desire for external validation. Journaling, when approached as a rigorous self-inquiry rather than a mere recounting of events, further deepens this awareness. We do not simply record what happened, but how we felt, what we thought, and why we believe we reacted the way we did. Prompt questions can guide this exploration. What emotions did this interaction evoke in me, and why? What underlying belief did this situation challenge or affirm? Where do I feel this emotion in my body? This consistent mapping of our emotional and cognitive landscape creates a comprehensive internal compass, allowing us to anticipate our vulnerabilities and understand the specific triggers a manipulator might inadvertently or deliberately exploit. From this foundation of awareness, we advance to emotional regulation. This is not about suppressing emotions, but rather about consciously managing their intensity and duration, preventing them from dictating our responses. Practical techniques include the Sakuri. Pause and label. Method. When confronted with a potentially manipulative situation or an internal surge of emotion, we consciously pause, take a deep breath, and mentally label the emotion we are experiencing. E.g., I am feeling anger. This is anxiety. I am experiencing guilt. This act of labeling, simple as it seems, engages the prefrontal cortex, shifting us from reactive limbic system responses to more deliberate processing. Furthermore, distress tolerance skills such as engaging in grounding exercises, focusing on sensory details in the immediate environment, or employing self-soothing techniques, equip us to navigate intense emotional discomfort without capitulating to external pressures or internal disquiet. Ultimately, resilience culminates in fostering and a locus of control. This means consciously shifting our focus from external circumstances and others' behaviors, which are often beyond our influence, to our internal responses, which are entirely within our purview. Manipulators thrive on our dependence on external validation, our fear of others' disapproval, and our belief that our well-being is contingent upon their actions. By cultivating an inner locus of control, we recognize that our worth, our decisions, and our emotional equilibrium are not dictated by external forces, but are products of our own internal architecture. This involves a daily practice of affirming our self-worth independently of others' opinions, making choices aligned with our values even when unpopular, and consciously choosing our responses to external stimuli. It is a profound act of self-ownership, directly confronting the manipulator's attempt to usurp our agency. If resilience builds our inner defenses, discernment sharpens our external perception, enabling us to accurately identify manipulative tactics as they unfold. This requires a vigilant gaze, one that pierces through superficial appearances and recognizes the incongruence between stated intentions and actual behaviors. Our first line of defense is maintaining skepticism towards excessive flattery. While genuine appreciation is nourishing, manipulators often employ love bombing, an overwhelming torrent of praise, admiration, and attention to quickly establish a bond and lower our defenses. The discerning individual learns to question the intensity and speed of such overtures. We ask ourselves, is this praise proportionate to our actual interaction or accomplishment? Does this person know me well enough to offer such profound compliments? Does this flattery feel genuine, or does it carry an undertone of expectation or ulterior motive? A healthy skepticism does not equate to cynicism, but rather a cautious assessment, a refusal to allow the ego's hunger for validation to blind us to potential exploitation. We learn to appreciate sincere compliments while remaining wary of those designed to create a debt of gratitude or to disarm our critical faculties. Crucially, discernment involves recognizing incongruence between words and actions. Manipulators are masters of verbal camouflage, often articulating noble intentions while their behaviors tell a different story. They might profess profound care while consistently neglecting our needs, or promise support while subtly undermining our efforts. The vigilant gaze learns to prioritize actions over words. When a person repeatedly fails to follow through on commitments, offers excuses that shift blame, or demonstrates a pattern of behavior that contradicts their stated values, these are red flags that demand attention. We train ourselves to observe the pattern of behavior rather than being swayed by isolated declarations or fleeting gestures. This requires a commitment to objective observation, detaching from the narrative the manipulator wishes to construct and attending instead to the empirical data of their conduct. Trusting intuition is another vital component of discernment, though often dismissed in our hyper-rationalized world. Our intuition, often experienced as a quote 61 or an inexplicable sense of unease, is not irrational. It is the subconscious mind rapidly processing vast amounts of nonverbal cues, micro-expressions, and subtle energetic shifts that our conscious mind may not immediately register. When an interaction leaves us feeling drained, confused, or vaguely uncomfortable, even if we cannot articulate a specific reason, we must learn to pause and honor that feeling. Rather than dismissing it as irrational, we should treat it as valuable data prompting further observation and critical inquiry. This involves cultivating a quiet inner space where these subtle signals can be heard, and then validating their existence by cross-referencing them with observable behaviors and patterns. Finally, discernment requires identifying recurring patterns of manipulative behavior. Manipulation is rarely a one-off event. It is a strategic, often unconscious, set of tactics deployed repeatedly. A manipulator might consistently guilt-trip, gaslight, or passive-aggressively undermine. Our task is to move beyond reacting to individual incidents and begin to connect the dots. By documenting instances of discomfort, noting specific tactics employed, and observing the impact these interactions have on our emotional and psychological state, we can construct a comprehensive picture. This pattern recognition allows us to predict future tactics, anticipate vulnerabilities, and prepare our responses, thereby neutralizing the element of surprise that manipulators often rely upon. This is the intellectual equivalent of strategic reconnaissance, mapping the terrain of the manipulator's psychological warfare. The ultimate goal of operationalizing resistance is not merely defense, but the active reclamation of our authentic self and the assertion of conscious agency. This is where the Nietzschean ideal of Selbstüberwindung finds its most practical expression. The foundational act of reclaiming agency is setting clear boundaries. Boundaries are not walls erected in anger, but rather the visible delineation of our personal space, our values, our time, and our emotional limits. They are statements of self-respect. To set clear boundaries, we must first know what our boundaries are. This requires the self-awareness cultivated through resilience practices. Once identified, boundaries must be communicated assertively, clearly, and consistently. This means using quote 62 statements, quote 63, quote 64, stating our limits without apology or excessive explanation, and preparing for potential pushback. Manipulators often test boundaries. Our consistency in upholding them is crucial for their effectiveness. This is an act of self-definition, clarifying for ourselves and others where we end and they begin. integral to boundary setting is practicing assertive communication. This stands in stark contrast to both passive capitulation and aggressive confrontation. Assertive communication involves expressing our needs, feelings, and opinions directly, respectfully, and honestly, while also respecting the rights and feelings of others. It means saying, quote 65, without guilt, expressing disagreement without fear, and advocating for ourselves without apology. Techniques include using factual observations rather than accusatory language, focusing on the impact of behavior rather than labeling intentions, and offering clear, actionable requests or statements of limits. This is the verbal manifestation of our sovereign will, articulating our agency in the relational field. The discomfort of saying, quote 66, is precisely what manipulators exploit, leveraging our desire for approval or our aversion to conflict. Therefore, embracing this discomfort of saying, quote 67, becomes a powerful act of self-overcoming. We must internalize the understanding that our primary responsibility is to our own well-being and integrity, not to the comfort or demands of others, especially when those demands are manipulative. This requires acknowledging the potential for guilt, disapproval, or even anger from the manipulator, and consciously choosing to prioritize our authentic self over these external pressures. Each, quote 60 to an unwanted imposition is a quote 69 to our own autonomy, strengthening our internal resolve and diminishing the manipulator's power. This leads directly to taking radical self-responsibility for our choices and values. Nietzsche's call for the creation of one's own values resonates here. We move beyond passively accepting societal norms or others' expectations, and instead consciously choose the principles that guide our lives. This means owning our decisions, accepting their consequences, and refraining from blaming others or external circumstances for our path. When we take radical self-responsibility, we become impenetrable to the manipulator's attempts to induce guilt or shame, as our choices are rooted in our own consciously affirmed values, not in their imposed expectations. This is the very essence of self-mastery, asserting our individual will against the currents of external influence. Finally, and perhaps most liberatingly, we must detach self-worth from external validation. Manipulators wield immense power over those whose sense of self is contingent upon others' approval. By cultivating an internal source of validation, we render ourselves immune to both the intoxicating allure of love bombing and the corrosive sting of criticism or gaslighting. This involves recognizing our inherent worth, celebrating our unique qualities, and deriving our sense of value from our integrity, our efforts, and our alignment with our chosen values. Practices such as daily affirmations of self-worth, focusing on personal accomplishments and growth rather than external accolades, and cultivating a supportive internal dialogue all contribute to building this robust inner validation system. It is the ultimate act of self-possession, severing the manipulative tether that binds our identity to the judgments of others. In this operationalization of resistance, we are not merely defending ourselves, we are actively forging a stronger, more authentic self. Each act of self-awareness, each moment of discernment, each boundary set, and each assertion of our values becomes a chisel stroke in the architectonics of our Selbstüberwindung. We move beyond Nietzsche's breakdown of human weakness to embody his vision of human potential, transforming ourselves from the manipulated into the masters of our own will, charting a course toward genuine freedom and self-sovereignty in an increasingly complex and subtly aggressive world. The journey is arduous, demanding constant vigilance and unwavering commitment, but the destination, an unassailable sense of self and an unburdened will, is the highest form of triumph. The journey toward Selbstüberwindung, toward becoming the sovereign architects of our own will, is not a destination but a continuous process of rigorous self-examination and courageous action. Having outlined the foundational strategies for resistance and self-mastery, we now delve deeper into the active cultivation of these principles, understanding that their true power lies not merely in intellectual comprehension, but in their consistent and conscious application within the crucible of daily life. This chapter explores the practicalities, the inherent challenges, and the transformative potential of integrating radical self-awareness, discerning vigilance, and authentic agency into the very fabric of our being. It is here that we move beyond theoretical understanding to the lived experience of asserting our will against the myriad subtle forces that seek to attenuate it. The development of resilience, as we have discussed, hinges upon three interconnected pillars: radical self-awareness, mastering emotional regulation, and fostering an inner locus of control. Radical self-awareness is more than a fleeting moment of introspection. It is a sustained, unsparing gaze into the landscape of our own psyche. Through practices such as mindfulness, we train our attention to observe thoughts, emotions, and bodily sensations without immediate judgment or attachment, recognizing them as transient phenomena rather than definitive aspects of our identity. Journaling, in this context, becomes a vital tool for externalizing internal dialogues, identifying recurring patterns of thought that make us vulnerable to manipulation, be it an excessive desire for approval, a fear of confrontation, or an ingrained sense of obligation. It allows us to map the precise contours of our cognitive biases, exposing the hidden pathways through which external influences gain purchase. This active documentation helps us to discern our authentic responses from those conditioned by others' expectations or manipulative ploys. Mastering emotional regulation does not imply the suppression of feeling, which would be both unhealthy and ultimately impossible. Instead, it signifies the capacity to experience emotions fully, to understand their origins and messages, and to choose our response rather than being involuntarily driven by them. When confronted with the emotional pressure of a manipulator, the sudden surge of guilt, the sting of implied criticism, the anxiety of potential disapproval, an unmastered emotional landscape leaves us susceptible. Nietzsche, in his critique of reactive morality, would recognize how unexamined emotions can lead to resentment, fostering a passive rather than an active stance toward life. By actively regulating our emotional states, we create a vital space between stimulus and response, a space where conscious will can assert itself. This involves identifying the physical sensations of an emerging emotion, naming it without judgment, and then consciously deciding how to engage with it. Techniques such as deep breathing, grounding exercises, or even simply delaying a response can provide the necessary buffer to prevent an impulsive, manipulated reaction. We learn to feel the discomfort without allowing it to dictate our actions, thereby reclaiming our emotional sovereignty. Fostering an inner locus of control is perhaps the most profound shift in this journey. It is the unwavering conviction that while we cannot always control external events, we absolutely control our reactions, interpretations, and ultimately, our values. Manipulators thrive on convincing us that our well-being, our worth, or our happiness depends on their approval, their resources, or their version of reality. They seek to externalize our locus of control, making us dependent. To reclaim it means accepting radical self-responsibility for our choices and the consequences thereof. It means understanding that our intrinsic value is not contingent upon external validation or the avoidance of conflict. This internal shift liberates us from the need to appease, to perform, or to conform, allowing us to align our actions with our authentic will rather than with external pressures. It is the active embodiment of Nietzsche's call to, quote 70, recognizing that our self-creation is an ongoing internal project, impervious to the external will of others. Beyond resilience, cultivating discernment is our primary defense against the insidious nature of manipulation. It requires a vigilant and skeptical stance, not born of cynicism, but of an educated awareness of human psychology and the pervasive drives of power. We must maintain a healthy skepticism toward excessive flattery or disproportionate praise, recognizing that love-bombing often precedes a request or a subtle attempt to erode boundaries. When words and actions diverge, when a manipulator professes care but consistently behaves in ways that undermine our well-being, our discernment must prioritize observed behavior over spoken assurances. This incongruence is a critical red flag, a signal that the presented persona is a strategic facade. Trusting intuition, however, is a more nuanced practice. Our intuition is not simply a gut feeling, but a complex synthesis of subconscious pattern recognition, accumulated experience, and emotional intelligence. To trust it effectively, we must first quiet the noise of external expectations and internal anxieties. Journaling and mindfulness aid in this, helping us distinguish between genuine intuitive insights and reactions born of fear, wishful thinking, or unresolved trauma. A truly intuitive signal often manifests as a subtle, persistent knowing, an internal sasti, quote 71, that resonates even when logical arguments or external pressures attempt to override it. It is the quiet voice that whispers caution when a situation feels, quote 72, despite superficial appearances. Learning to heed this voice requires courage, as it often means going against prevailing social norms or confronting uncomfortable truths. Moreover, identifying recurring patterns of manipulative behavior is crucial. Manipulators, by their nature, are creatures of habit. They employ a limited repertoire of tactics that, once recognized, become predictable. Is there a consistent cycle of idealization followed by devaluation? Do certain individuals routinely deflect blame, gaslight, or guilt trip when confronted? Are promises frequently made but rarely kept? By meticulously observing and documenting these patterns, perhaps in our journal, we begin to see beyond the individual instances to the overarching strategy. This meta-awareness strips the manipulator of their power, transforming their seemingly random actions into predictable ploys. It allows us to anticipate their moves, to prepare our responses, and to understand that their behavior is a reflection of their own will to power, not a judgment on our inherent worth. This analytical detachment empowers us to respond strategically rather than react emotionally, severing the manipulative loop. Finally, the ultimate expression of our sovereign will lies in fostering genuine authenticity and conscious agency. This is where we actively reshape our interactions and reclaim our relational landscape. Setting clear boundaries is perhaps the most direct and potent act of agency. Boundaries are not walls erected out of fear, but rather clear delineations of what we will and will not accept, what we will and will not tolerate, and what we value and protect. They communicate our self-worth and define the parameters of respectful interaction. The act of setting a boundary often elicits resistance, anger, or even intensified manipulation from those accustomed to breaching them. This is precisely why embracing the discomfort of saying, quote 73, is fundamental. Quote 74 is a complete sentence. It requires no further justification or apology. Learning to articulate it firmly, calmly, and without guilt is a profound act of self-possession, an assertion of our autonomous will. Practicing assertive communication goes hand in hand with boundary setting. It means expressing our thoughts, feelings, and needs directly and respectfully, without aggression or passivity. This involves using quote 75 statements, clearly stating our perspective and advocating for our rights while acknowledging the rights of others. Manipulators thrive in environments of ambiguity and indirect communication, where they can exploit unspoken assumptions or interpret silence as consent. Assertive communication removes this fertile ground, bringing clarity and accountability to interactions. It requires us to be clear about our values and to communicate them, even when they differ from those of others, embodying a Nietzschean honesty in our self-expression. Ultimately, authentic agency culminates in taking radical self-responsibility for our choices and values and detaching our self-worth from external validation. This is the core of Selbstüberwindung in action. It means recognizing that our life is our own creation, and every choice, every boundary, every act of communication contributes to the architecture of ourself. We cease to be defined by what others think of us, by their approval or disapproval, by their attempts to praise or diminish. Our self-worth becomes an internal metric, derived from living in alignment with our deepest values and convictions, regardless of external reactions. This detachment is not indifference. It is liberation. It allows us to stand firm in our truth, to navigate the complexities of social influence with an unshakable inner compass, and to continuously overcome the limitations imposed by others and, crucially, by our own conditioned responses. The path of Selbstüberwindung is thus an ongoing, dynamic engagement with the world and with ourselves. It demands continuous vigilance, persistent self-inquiry, and the courage to assert our will in the face of both overt and subtle pressures. It is a testament to our capacity for growth, for self-creation, and for forging an authentic existence rooted in sovereign self-possession. The journey is arduous, but the rewards, true freedom, and an unassailable sense of self are immeasurable. We are called not to merely survive the machinations of others, but to transcend them, to become the masters of our own becoming. The comprehensive theoretical and practical framework we have meticulously constructed spanning psychological vulnerabilities, spiritual insights, and the bracing philosophy of Nietzsche, serves as our compass. Yet, the true crucible of Selbstüberwindung is not found in intellectual understanding alone, but in the sustained, often arduous application of these principles within the messy, unpredictable currents of daily life. We now turn our gaze from the architecture of discernment and resilience to the dynamic landscape of its ongoing implementation, acknowledging that the journey toward authentic selfhood is not a destination, but a perpetual act of becoming, a continuous assertion of sovereign will against the myriad forces that seek to diminish it. One of the most profound realizations we must embrace is that the mere act of recognizing manipulation does not instantly dissolve its power or deter the manipulator. Indeed, our newfound awareness often initiates a more intense, albeit often subtle, phase of the manipulative dynamic. Those adept at such tactics, whether consciously or unconsciously, thrive on the predictability of our responses, on our desire for harmony, or our fear of confrontation. When these habitual buttons cease to yield the desired outcome, a manipulator's initial response is rarely capitulation. Instead, we frequently observe what behavioral psychology terms an extinction burst, an intensified effort to regain control, a more forceful or insidious deployment of their tactics, precisely because the familiar strategies are no longer effective. This requires of us not only vigilance but a profound, unwavering resolve. Consider the dynamics within deeply entrenched relationships, familial bonds, long-term partnerships, or established professional environments, where disentanglement is complex, emotionally fraught, or practically unfeasible. Here, the strategies of boundary setting, assertive communication, and radical self-responsibility are not singular acts, but continuous processes of reaffirmation. We discover that a boundary, once articulated, is often immediately tested. The manipulator, accustomed to permeable limits, will probe, rationalize, or even emotionally blackmail to breach the newly established perimeter. It is in these moments that our theoretical understanding must translate into visceral fortitude. We must resist the powerful internal pull towards reverting to old patterns, the desire to avoid conflict, the fear of upsetting another, the ingrained belief that our role is to accommodate. This is where the spiritual dimension of detachment, not as indifference but as a protective inner space, becomes indispensable, allowing us to observe the emotional machinations without being consumed by them. The power of no emerges as a particularly potent, often uncomfortable assertion of sovereign will. In a society that frequently valorizes compliance and self-sacrifice, especially for certain demographics, the act of refusing, without elaborate justification or apology, can feel revolutionary. Yet, it is precisely this discomfort we must learn to embrace. The guilt that often accompanies a firm no is not necessarily an indicator of wrongdoing on our part, but often a conditioned response to the manipulator's implied or explicit disapproval. Nietzsche's philosophy reminds us that the will to power is not merely an external drive, but an internal one. To say, quote 79, to another's imposition is to say yes to our own autonomy, to affirm our own values and priorities in the face of external pressure. This is a radical act of self-ownership, a refusal to be merely a means to another's ends. Beyond the intimate interpersonal sphere, the modern digital landscape presents an ever-evolving theatre for subtle manipulation, amplifying pre-existing human vulnerabilities to unprecedented degrees. The algorithms that curate our social feeds, the relentless pursuit of raw quote 81 and shares, and the carefully constructed narratives of influencers and platforms all coalesce into a pervasive system designed to shape our perceptions, desires, and behaviors. This is a sophisticated expression of the quote 82 on a grand scale, where attention, engagement, and ideological alignment become the currency of control. We are subtly nudged towards certain viewpoints, our biases reinforced by echo chambers, and our self-worth implicitly tied to external digital validation. Digital discernment, therefore, becomes an extension of the broader strategies we have discussed. It requires a conscious skepticism towards the information we consume, an acute awareness of the emotional appeals disguised as objective truths, and a deliberate practice of disengaging from cycles of outrage, comparison, or performative self-presentation. We must question the source, the intent, and the underlying message of digital content, applying the same rigor we would to an in-person interaction. This means cultivating an inner locus of control that is impervious to the ephemeral fluctuations of digital approval, understanding that true self-worth is an internal construct, not an external metric. It demands a conscious choice to curate our own digital environment, to seek out diverse perspectives, and to recognize when our attention is being commodified or our emotions exploited. Ultimately, sustaining Selbstüberwindung is about cultivating an unassailable inner fortress, a sanctuary of authentic selfhood that is impermeable to external pressures. This requires a radical self-responsibility, a profound acceptance that while we cannot control the actions or intentions of others, we possess absolute sovereignty over our own reactions, choices, and internal state. This is the ultimate Nietzschean affirmation of agency, to recognize that our freedom lies not in the absence of external challenges, but in our capacity to respond to them from a place of strength and integrity. We cease to be victims of circumstance and become conscious architects of our own lives. The practice of solitude and intentional reflection becomes paramount in this ongoing process. In a world saturated with noise, distractions, and the incessant demands of others, carving out time for introspection is not a luxury but a necessity. It is in these moments of quiet contemplation that we can truly connect with our deepest values, solidify our sense of self, and discern the authentic voice of our own will from the cacophony of external expectations. This is where the true work of spiritual liberation unfolds, where we shed the accumulated layers of societal conditioning and external validation to reveal the unique, irreducible core of our being. It is in this inner space that we fortify our defenses against the insidious encroachment of manipulative forces, becoming less reactive and more intentional in our engagement with the world. The journey of Selbstüberwindung is undeniably demanding, fraught with moments of discomfort, self-doubt, and the temptation to revert to familiar, albeit disempowering patterns. Yet, we must reframe these challenges not as obstacles to be avoided, but as opportunities for profound growth. Each instance where we successfully assert a boundary, say, quote, 83 Urium, with conviction, or resist the urge to seek external validation, strengthens our character and tempers our will. The friction generated by confronting manipulative forces can, paradoxically, make us more resilient, more discerning, and more deeply aligned with our authentic selves. This ongoing process of overcoming, of continually striving to live in alignment with our highest values, is the very essence of a life lived with integrity and purpose. We conclude this exploration not with a final destination, but with an enduring invitation to embrace the continuous dynamic process of Selbstüberwindung. It is a commitment to lifelong vigilance, to persistent self-assessment, and to the courageous, unwavering assertion of one's sovereign will. This journey is the ultimate affirmation of life, a testament to our capacity for growth, for freedom, and for forging a self that is truly our own, impermeable to the subtle, ubiquitous forces that seek to define and diminish us. It is the arduous, yet profoundly liberating path toward becoming who we truly are, in defiance of all attempts at subjugation. We have explored the intricate scaffolding of manipulation, dissecting its psychological roots, its spiritual vulnerabilities, and its insidious manifestations in the modern age. We have also laid out the foundational strategies for resistance, drawing upon a synthesis of contemporary insight and Nietzsche's bracing philosophy. Yet the culmination of this understanding is not a static state of enlightenment, a singular victory against an external foe, but rather a dynamic, perpetual process of self-creation and self-fortification. The unassailable inner fortress of authentic selfhood and sovereign will is not a pre-built structure awaiting occupation. It is an architecture we are ceaselessly designing, constructing, and reinforcing, brick by conscious brick, choice by deliberate choice. We become indeed the conscious architects of our own lives, but this architecture is never truly finished. It is an ongoing, evolving masterpiece. The journey of Selbstüberwindung, of self-overcoming, is not merely about identifying and deflecting manipulative assaults. It is fundamentally about the relentless cultivation of an internal landscape so robust and self-aware that the very ground upon which manipulation seeks to take root is denied. This requires a dedication that transcends sporadic effort, demanding instead a sustained, almost monastic commitment to inner work. Our initial foray into radical self-awareness involved practices like mindfulness and journaling, designed to bring our subconscious processes and emotional reactions into the light of conscious scrutiny. To sustain this, we must evolve these practices into a continuous internal audit. This is not merely observing thoughts and feelings as they arise. It is about actively interrogating their origins, their validity, and their potential to be exploited. We ask, why am I feeling this way? Is this emotion truly mine, or is it a reverberation of an external influence, a subtly implanted seed of guilt or inadequacy? What unexamined assumptions or unspoken desires might be colouring my perception? This advanced form of self-awareness moves beyond passive observation to active inquiry, developing a critical distance from our own internal narratives. We learn to recognize the subtle shifts in our energy, the nascent stirrings of resentment or fear, the quiet erosion of resolve before it manifests in compliance. Journaling in this context becomes a forensic tool, a detailed log of our psychological responses to daily interactions, allowing us to identify patterns that might otherwise remain invisible. We chart the moments of subtle coercion, the instances where our boundaries were tested, and our responses both effective and ineffective. This meta-awareness, awareness of our awareness, is the bedrock upon which genuine sovereignty is built. It is a constant re-evaluation of our values, a Nietzschean imperative to question even our most cherished beliefs, ensuring they are truly ours and not merely inherited or imposed. Emotional regulation, initially framed as the ability to pause and label or practice distress tolerance, matures into a profound capacity for emotional integration. We move beyond merely managing difficult emotions to understanding them as vital messengers, even allies. The discomfort that arises when confronting a manipulator, the anxiety of setting a boundary, the guilt induced by another's passive aggression, these are not signals to retreat, but rather invitations to deepen our resilience. To truly master emotional regulation is to cultivate a radical acceptance of discomfort as an inevitable, even necessary component of growth and authentic living. We recognize that the peace offered by compliance is a false peace, a fleeting cessation of conflict purchased at the cost of self-integrity. The true peace, the peace of the sovereign individual, emerges from an inner alignment that can weather external storms. This involves actively leaning into the discomfort, allowing ourselves to fully experience the physiological sensations of fear or anger without allowing them to dictate our actions. We develop a capacity to sit with the unpleasantness that arises when we assert our will, understanding that this temporary disequilibrium is merely the friction generated by our self-overcoming. Nietzsche's philosophy, which often champions the embrace of struggle and the forging of strength through adversity, finds its direct application here. We become stronger not by avoiding pain, but by transforming our relationship to it. An inner locus of control, initially understood as the conviction that our outcomes are primarily a result of our own actions, evolves into a pervasive lived reality that permeates every decision and interaction. It is the unwavering conviction that our worth, our values, and our happiness are internally generated and sustained, impervious to external validation or disapproval. This manifests as a profound sense of self-responsibility, not as a burden, but as the ultimate expression of freedom. We no longer look to others for approval, nor do we cede the power of our emotional state to their whims. When faced with manipulative tactics, the individual with a fully integrated inner locus of control perceives them not as threats to their being, but as external attempts to commandeer their will. They are not shaken by gaslighting because their internal reality is robustly self-affirmed. They are not swayed by flattery because their self-worth is not contingent upon it. They are not paralyzed by guilt-tripping because their ethical compass is internally calibrated. This state of being is a direct embodiment of Nietzsche's call for individuals to create their own values, to become the Übermensch in the sense of one who transcends conventional morality to forge a self-authored existence. The external world may offer opinions, judgments, and pressures, but the sovereign individual filters these through their own meticulously constructed framework of values, making choices that align with their authentic will. While we have outlined strategies for discernment, skepticism, recognizing incongruence, trusting intuition, the truly challenging terrain lies in applying these in the complex, emotionally charged relationships of our daily lives. Manipulation is not always wielded by strangers or overt adversaries. Often, it emanates from those we love, respect, or depend upon. Here, discernment requires an even finer calibration, a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about individuals whose intentions we might prefer to view through a benevolent lens. We learn to differentiate between genuine influence and manipulative pressure. A request, even a strong one from a friend, is distinct from a guilt-laden demand. A candid critique from a mentor differs fundamentally from undermining veiled as concern. This refinement of discernment demands that we detach from outcome dependence and the desire for harmonious superficiality. It means trusting our gut feelings even when our intellect or our emotional attachment attempts to rationalize away red flags. It necessitates the courage to see people, including ourselves as they are, with all their imperfections and their unconscious drives, rather than as we wish them to be. This is where Nietzsche's unflinching gaze at the cestus quod est hall in all human interactions becomes an invaluable, albeit often uncomfortable, guide. We apply his radical skepticism not just to grand philosophical ideas, but to the subtle power plays embedded in our most intimate exchanges. The path to authentic selfhood and sovereign will is often solitary. As we develop our inner fortress, as we clarify our boundaries and assert our true values, we inevitably become less pliable, less amenable to the subtle and not so subtle demands of others. This can lead to what we might perceive as a cirque quote 89, not necessarily an absence of connection, but a profound sense of standing apart from the herd, of having chosen a path that prioritizes integrity over conventional acceptance. Manipulators, in particular, will often react to our newfound resilience with quote 90 escalating their tactics in an attempt to restore the old dynamic. But beyond these overt challenges, there is a more subtle social cost. Some relationships built on the shifting sands of our former compliance may simply dissolve. Others may become strained as those accustomed to our malleability struggle with our newfound assertiveness. This is a crucial test of our Selbstüberwindung. Can we bear the discomfort of others' disapproval? Can we withstand the pressure to revert to old patterns for the sake of perceived harmony? Nietzsche understood that true strength often requires an individual to stand alone, to forge their own path, even if it means alienating those who cannot comprehend or tolerate their self-authored existence. The courage to embrace this loneliness, the willingness to be misunderstood or even rejected for the sake of our authentic self, is a hallmark of the sovereign individual. It is the ultimate detachment from external validation, a profound affirmation of our intrinsic worth. The journey of self-overcoming is not a linear progression towards a final static destination. Instead, it is more akin to Nietzsche's concept of eternal recurrence, not as a literal repetition of events, but as the perpetual re-emergence of similar challenges, requiring us to apply our principles with renewed vigilance and deeper understanding. Each new encounter with manipulation, each new test of our boundaries, becomes an opportunity to refine our resolve, to strengthen our inner architecture, and to deepen our commitment to authentic selfhood. We will encounter new forms of manipulation, new contexts, and new relationships that demand our discernment. We will face internal doubts, moments of fatigue, and the temptation to revert to easier, less demanding patterns of compliance. This is precisely why the inner fortress must be constantly reinforced. its defenses continually upgraded. It is a process of continuous becoming, a perpetual state of growth and self-creation. Every time we successfully navigate a manipulative dynamic, every time we assert a boundary, every time we choose integrity over comfort, we are not just defending ourselves, we are actively shaping who we are becoming. We are exercising our will to power in its most conscious and constructive form. The arduous yet liberating journey we undertake leads to a profound personal transformation. It is not merely the absence of manipulation that defines this state, but the presence of an unshakable sense of self, a pervasive intentionality in our choices, and an authentic connection to our deepest values. We move from being reactors to external stimuli to being conscious creators of our internal and external realities. This is the ultimate promise of Selbstüberwindung, to become the conscious architect of a life lived by design, not by default. We are no longer defined by the subtle aggressions of others or the societal pressures to conform, but by the deliberate choices we make in alignment with our sovereign will. We become individuals who not only recognize manipulation, but possess the inner resources to render it impotent. More importantly, we become individuals capable of genuine, unburdened connection, offering our authentic selves to the world without fear or compromise. This is the true expression of human potential, a life lived with courage, clarity, and an unyielding commitment to our own unique becoming. The journey towards self-possession, we have established, is not a linear ascent but a continuous process of becoming, a perpetual engagement with the forces that seek to diminish our autonomy and the internal vulnerabilities that invite their ingress. This arduous path of Selbstüberwindung, self-overcoming, demands an unwavering vigilance. For the moment we assert our sovereign will, we inevitably encounter what we term extinction bursts. These are not merely retaliatory acts, they are the desperate, often unconscious attempts by the manipulator to re-establish a familiar dynamic, to reclaim the ground lost when we dared to draw a boundary or articulate an authentic desire. When a manipulator's accustomed tactics fail, the initial reaction is rarely acceptance. Instead, we observe an escalation, a heightened intensity of the very behaviors we are striving to resist. The guilt tripper, finding their emotional leverage diminished, may amplify their narrative of victimhood or directly accuse us of selfishness and ingratitude. The flattery wielder, seeing their compliments no longer sway our judgment, might resort to subtle undermining, sowing seeds of doubt about our competence or character in the minds of others. The gaslighter, confronted with our firm grasp of reality, may double down on their denials, fabricating increasingly elaborate alternative versions of events, or even feign confusion and hurt at our perceived. Quote 96. These maneuvers are a psychological test, designed to exploit our ingrained desire for harmony, our aversion to conflict, and our latent guilt. They are an attempt to wear down our resolve, to make the cost of authenticity seem too high, compelling us to revert to the familiar, albeit draining patterns of compliance. The internal impact of these extinction bursts is profound. We may find ourselves assailed by self-doubt, questioning the validity of our perceptions and the righteousness of our boundaries. The manipulator's feigned hurt can trigger a resurgence of empathy, tempting us to retract our assertions to alleviate their apparent suffering, a suffering often strategically deployed. This is where our spiritual training in detachment and discernment becomes paramount, allowing us to recognize the performance, to separate genuine distress from manipulative display. Nietzsche, in his radical critique of conventional morality, would remind us that such suffering is often a weapon, a form of resentment wielded to reassert control. To succumb is to betray our nascent freedom, to exchange the promise of genuine selfhood for the illusion of peace. Beyond these immediate confrontations, the path of authenticity invariably leads to a period of profound loneliness. This is not merely the absence of companionship, but the dissolution of relationships built upon these shaky foundations of compliance, unspoken expectations, and manufactured harmony. When we cease to be the pliable object of another's will, when we refuse to play the assigned role in their narrative, those who benefited from our previous malleability may withdraw. This can manifest as overt rejection, passive-aggressive distancing, or a gradual fading of connections that once seemed robust. The discomfort is acute, for we are social beings, deeply wired for connection and belonging. To stand alone, especially after having been enmeshed in relationships that, however dysfunctional, provided a sense of identity and purpose, can feel like an existential void. This loneliness is often exacerbated by the broader societal pressure to conform, to adhere to the quote 1990 that Nietzsche so vehemently critiqued. Our culture frequently celebrates consensus, compromise, and fitting in, sometimes at the expense of individual truth. When we choose a path less travelled, one defined by internal conviction rather than external validation, we risk being perceived as difficult, arrogant, or even selfish. The free spirit, the one who dares to forge their own values, often finds themselves in stark contrast to the quote $100 who prioritizes comfort, security, and approval above all else. This can be a harrowing realization, forcing us to confront the possibility that the very act of becoming our authentic selves may alienate us from those we once held dear and from the comfortable embrace of societal norms. Yet, it is crucial to distinguish this initial, often painful, loneliness from the chosen, empowering state of solitude. Loneliness is a feeling of unwanted isolation, a yearning for connection that is absent. Solitude, by contrast, is a deliberate choice, a space for introspection, self-communion, and the cultivation of inner strength. It is within this solitude that we can truly hear our own voice, unadulterated by external demands or expectations. It is here that we develop the quote 101 and resilience necessary to navigate the ongoing challenges. This hardness is not a callous indifference, but an unshakable inner fortitude, a self-reliance that allows us to value our own judgment and experience above the fluctuating tides of external opinion. It is the courage to be disliked, a profound liberation from the tyranny of others' approval. Cultivating this inner strength involves a continuous process of self-examination. We must vigilantly identify not only the external manipulations, but also our own internal vulnerabilities that might invite them. Are we still unconsciously seeking approval? Do we still fear confrontation to the point of self-betrayal? Are there lingering attachments to outcomes or identities that prevent us from acting with full integrity? This self-inquiry is a spiritual discipline, a constant purification of the nafs, an ongoing commitment to existential authenticity. It acknowledges that the journey of self-overcoming is cyclical, not merely a single battle won, but a series of skirmishes and triumphs that perpetually refine our being. This cyclical nature of challenge and growth brings us to a profound Nietzschean concept, the eternal recurrence. While a complex cosmological theory in its full articulation, we employ it here as a powerful metaphor for the perpetual re-emergence of life's tests and the imperative to affirm our choices. Imagine, Nietzsche posits, that every moment of your life, every decision, every joy, every suffering will repeat itself eternally, precisely as it is. Would you embrace this thought? Would you will your life to be so, including its difficulties and its struggles? This thought experiment serves as an ultimate test of our authenticity, a demand that we live each moment with such conviction and integrity that we would desire its endless return. In the context of manipulation, the eternal recurrence compels us to recognize that each confrontation, each assertion of self, is not merely an isolated incident but a foundational act that shapes who we become, not just for this moment, but for all time. If we succumb to manipulation, if we betray our boundaries for temporary peace, we are effectively willing this pattern of self-betrayal to recur indefinitely. Conversely, if we stand firm, if we choose authenticity and courage in the face of an extinction burst, we are affirming a life of integrity, willing that strength and self-possession to be the recurring theme of our existence. This elevates the stakes of every interaction, transforming life into an intentional act of quote 1-3, a continuous sculpture of the self. The ultimate reward for this arduous path is not merely freedom from manipulation, but the profound freedom for something greater, the possibility of genuine connection, unburdened by hidden agendas, unspoken resentments, or the subtle erosions of autonomy. When we are sovereign architects of our own lives, grounded in inner freedom and unshakable self-possession, we become capable of forming relationships based on mutual respect, honesty, and shared values. These are connections that honor the integrity of both individuals, where love is not a tool for control, but a celebration of distinct, authentic beings. The loneliness we experience in the interim gives way to a profound sense of self-communion, and eventually to the possibility of forging bonds with others who also walk the path of self-overcoming. This is the continuous act of quote 104, not just as a survival strategy, but as a form of art, a testament to the sovereign will that shapes our existence into a masterpiece of self-created meaning. We are not merely escaping chains. We are building a new world, one brick of authenticity at a time. We have explored the arduous ascent of Selbstüberwindung, charting a course through the treacherous terrain of manipulation and the deceptive allure of compliant comfort. Our journey has led us to the precipice of self-sovereignty, where the serves not as a threat of endless repetition, but as a profound call to live each moment with such unwavering integrity that we would affirm its perpetual return. This affirmation, we contend, is the bedrock upon which the architecture of an authentic existence is built. An existence not merely free from the chains of external control, but vibrantly alive for the conscious, deliberate creation of self and genuine connection. Yet, to stand on this precipice is not to have arrived at a final destination. The work of Selbstüberwindung is, by its very nature, continuous. It is a dynamic process of vigilance, refinement, and expansion, demanding that we constantly recalibrate our inner compass and fortify our resolve. The subtle aggressions of the will to power do not vanish from the world simply because we have learned to recognize them. Rather, they adapt, shifting their forms and intensifying their pressure in the face of our newfound resilience. Thus, Chapter 11 will delve into the ongoing practicalities of maintaining this self-sovereign state, examining how we refine our discernment, cultivate truly authentic relationships, and embrace a wise vulnerability, all while navigating the persistent challenges inherent in our human condition. We will consider how Nietzsche's radical affirmation of life, even in the face of its inherent struggles, provides a robust framework for sustaining this journey. Our initial training in discernment focused on identifying overt manipulative tactics, the flattery that feels too saccharine, the guilt trips that tug at our ingrained sense of obligation, the gaslighting that destabilizes our perception of reality. As we progress, however, the manipulators we encounter, or even those aspects of ourselves that might lean towards subtle coercion, become more sophisticated. The quote 106 we discussed earlier are but one manifestation of this adaptive challenge. Therefore, our discernment must evolve beyond merely recognizing patterns to understanding the underlying intent and energy behind interactions. This refined discernment requires an acute sensitivity to incongruence. We learn to listen not just to the words spoken, but to the resonance or dissonance between those words and the speaker's actions, body language, and the emotional atmosphere they cultivate. A manipulator, for instance, might offer effusive praise while subtly undermining our contributions in a group setting. They might profess deep care while consistently failing to respect our boundaries. Our task is to develop a psychic radar, as it were, that registers these subtle misalignments, these minute tremors in the fabric of interaction. This is not about becoming cynical, but about becoming profoundly attuned to truth, which often resides in the space between what is said and what is truly meant, between what is promised and what is delivered. Furthermore, we must learn to discern our own internal responses with greater precision. When we feel a sudden inexplicable exhaustion after an interaction, a lingering sense of unease, or a subtle pressure to comply that we cannot quite articulate, these are vital signals. These somatic and emotional cues are the body's wisdom communicating what the conscious mind might initially miss. Radical self-awareness, practiced through mindfulness and journaling, becomes an indispensable tool for decoding these internal messages, allowing us to trace them back to their origins and identify the precise points of energetic drain or subtle imposition. We recognize that our discomfort is not necessarily a sign of our own failing, but often a legitimate response to an encroaching will. Nietzsche, with his relentless critique of conventional morality, implicitly encourages this radical discernment. He would challenge us to look beyond the surface of altruistic gestures, to question the motives behind every proclaimed virtue. Is it genuine benevolence, or a subtle play for power, for social credit, for a sense of superiority? His philosophy compels us to strip away the veils of societal convention and personal illusion, to see the raw, often uncomfortable drives that animate human interaction. This bracing honesty, while initially unsettling, ultimately sharpens our ability to perceive reality as it is, rather than as we wish it to be. Having cultivated and assessed quote 10 and sharpened our discernment, we arrive at a critical juncture, the cultivation of authentic relationships. If our past connections were often built on a foundation of compliance, fear of disapproval, or a desperate need for external validation, then the shedding of these bonds, while painful, creates a fertile ground for something far more profound. Authentic relationships are not merely the absence of manipulation. They are characterized by a mutual respect for autonomy, a genuine desire for the other's flourishing, and a shared commitment to truth and vulnerability. These relationships thrive on a different kind of energy, one of expansion rather than contraction. Instead of feeling drained or diminished, we feel enlivened, challenged to grow, and truly seen. The will to power, in its healthiest manifestation, expresses itself here not as domination, but as an enabling force, a desire to empower the other, to inspire their own Selbstüberwindung, and to co-create meaning. This is the friendship of the higher men that Nietzsche alluded to, where individuals of strong will and integrity uplift each other without seeking to subsume or control. Building such relationships requires us to practice the very principles we have embraced for ourselves. Clear and compassionate communication. We articulate our boundaries not as weapons, but as expressions of self-respect and invitations for others to meet us in a space of mutual honor. We communicate our needs and desires directly, without relying on hints, passive aggression, or manipulative tactics of our own. Reciprocity and equity. Authentic relationships are characterized by a balanced exchange, where both parties feel valued, heard, and respected. There is no consistent giver and taker, no perpetual victim and rescuer, but rather a dynamic interplay of support and challenge. Embracing disagreement. True connection does not demand perfect alignment of thought or feeling. In fact, the capacity to respectfully disagree, to engage in robust intellectual or emotional sparring without fear of abandonment or retribution, is a hallmark of strong bonds. It signifies a trust that the relationship can withstand divergence, that individual autonomy is respected even amidst difference. Shared vulnerability. While our inner fortress protects us from exploitation, it is not a prison. Wise vulnerability involves the conscious, intentional sharing of our authentic selves, our fears, hopes, imperfections, with those who have demonstrated trustworthiness and a capacity for empathy. This is not a rash opening of old wounds, but a measured unveiling of our true being within a secure relational container. It is the brave act of letting ourselves be seen, knowing that true connection flourishes in this shared humanity. The concept of an inner fortress might at first glance seem to contradict the idea of vulnerability. Yet this is a crucial paradox to understand. Our fortress is built not to isolate us, but to protect our core self, our authentic sovereignty, from external assault. It is the foundation that allows us to choose when and how to be vulnerable, rather than being forced into it by emotional blackmail or a desperate need for approval. Wise vulnerability emerges from a position of strength, not weakness. When we are internally secure, when our self-worth is not dependent on external validation, we can afford to open ourselves to others without fear of being shattered. We understand that while vulnerability carries inherent risks, it is also the gateway to genuine intimacy and profound connection. We are no longer exposing ourselves out of a deficit, but sharing from an abundance of self-possession. This discerning vulnerability also extends to how we perceive others. Having understood the prevalence of the will to power, even in its unconscious forms, we can approach others with a blend of caution and compassion. We recognize that many manipulators are themselves deeply wounded, operating from a place of insecurity, fear, or a perceived lack of power. This understanding does not excuse their behavior, nor does it obligate us to tolerate it, but it allows us to respond from a place of informed strength, rather than reactive anger or fear. It cultivates a kind of philosophical distance that Nietzsche often advocated, enabling us to observe human nature with a clear eye, without being emotionally entangled in its pathologies. The culmination of Selbstüberwindung is not merely survival, but a joyous affirmation of life in its entirety, a resounding yes to existence, even with its inherent struggles, its constant flux, and the omnipresent dance of power dynamics. This is Nietzsche's amor fati, the love of one's fate, which is not a passive resignation but an active embrace of all that is, including the challenges that forge our character. To live authentically is to embody this affirmation daily. It means accepting that discomfort is not always a sign of something wrong, but often a signal of growth. It means embracing the solitude that comes with forging our own path, knowing that this inner strength is the prerequisite for meaningful connection. It means continuously questioning, continuously evolving, and continuously striving to align our actions with our deepest values. The journey against manipulation, then, transcends the mere avoidance of external control. It transforms into a profound spiritual and philosophical quest for self-mastery and the creation of a life that is truly our own. We learn to wield our own will to power, not in domination, but in self-creation, not in the imposition of values, but in the articulation and embodiment of our unique truth. This active yes to life means embracing creative tension, understanding that growth often arises from friction, from the dialectic between opposing forces. We do not shy away from challenges, but meet them as opportunities for further Selbstüberwindung. Cultivating inner joy. Finding sources of joy and meaning that are independent of external circumstances or the approval of others. This inner wellspring of contentment becomes a powerful buffer against manipulative attempts to control our emotional state. Living with purpose, aligning our daily actions with a larger vision for our lives, a sense of meaning that transcends immediate gratification or external pressures. This purpose acts as an internal anchor, guiding our choices and fortifying our resolve. Continuous learning and evolution. Recognizing that our understanding of ourselves and the world is always expanding, we remain open to new perspectives, willing to revise our beliefs, and committed to lifelong intellectual and spiritual growth. In essence, Chapter 11 marks a transition from the initial liberation from manipulation to the ongoing conscious construction of a life for authentic selfhood. We recognize that the manipulators will persist, that the human tendency towards subtle coercion is deeply ingrained, but our inner landscape has been irrevocably transformed. We are no longer merely reactive. We are proactive architects of our own existence, guided by the principles of radical self-awareness, discerning vigilance, and an unwavering affirmation of our sovereign will. The path is not without its trials, but it is a path walked with clarity, integrity, and the profound freedom that comes from being truly, unapologetically oneself. This is the enduring legacy of Nietzsche's bracing challenge: to become who we are, fully and without compromise,